Okay, hello everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to Chronic Crisis, the Humanities Contextualize 2020, which is co-sponsored by the Center for Humanities Research and the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. The idea for this panel grew out of discussions that I had with Professor Lincoln Mullen, who along with Professor John Turner and Dr. Jessica Mack, has been working on the Pandemic Religions Project, which you'll hear more about shortly. Our four panelists will first briefly explain the humanities-related work that they've recently engaged around the multiple crises of 2020, the pandemic, the ongoing racially motivated violence in this country, political polarization, as a way to open up a larger discussion that we'll have and that we hope you'll join about the value of the humanities in times of crisis. The way that the format for today will involve each of the panelists saying a little bit about the way that their work engages these current crises. And I will pose questions to the panelists, which they will answer. And we would like you all in the audience to feel part of this discussion. And if at any point you have a question that you would like to ask, please use the reaction button at the bottom of your screen. If you click on the reactions button, you'll see a place where you can raise your hand. Raise your hand and I'll call on you and you'll be able to ask your question to join this discussion. So as I said, I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. And after that, I'll ask them each to explain briefly the way their work engages these current crises. Dr. Meredith Lair is Associate Professor in the Department of History and Art History. She's the author of Armed with Abundance, Consumerism and Soldiering in the Vietnam War, and she's currently working on a book-length project entitled The Invisible Soldier, Vietnam Veteran Activism and the Militarization of America. Dr. Tehama Lopez Bunyasi is Assistant Professor at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution here at George Mason. She, along with Candace Watt-Smith, is the author of Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter, in addition to many articles and book chapters. Dr. Jessica Mack is a postdoctoral fellow at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media. She teaches the urban history of Mexico City and the history of universities, and at RRCHNM is project manager for Collecting These Times, American Jewish Experiences of the Pandemic, and also the Pandemic Religion Digital Collection. And finally, Dr. Andrew Peterson is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy at George Mason University. He's also an affiliate researcher at the University of Pennsylvania Memory Center, a guest researcher at the National Institutes of Health Department of Bioethics, and a Greenwald faculty scholar. His publications on the ethics of resource allocation and bioethics more broadly are too numerous to count, but he will share some of this work with us today. So now I would like to turn the floor over to Meredith Lair.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Allison. You're there in the top right left of my screen. Thank you for organizing. And also congratulations to everyone who helped to launch Mason Center for Humanities Research. So hopefully this is my first experience with the center, and I look forward to many more. So I'm a faculty member in the Department of History and Art History. And I teach on war in American society, the Vietnam War. I consider myself a social and cultural historian who studies war and militarism, which is slightly different than being a military historian or someone who studies the institution of the military. So I'm going to share some thoughts about that, and I want to share some experiences teaching last fall, reflecting specifically on this idea of teaching humanities in a time of crisis. So last fall, I taught an undergraduate class called The History of the Election of 2020. I taught that, obviously while the election was unfolding. And the genesis of the class actually lay in 2016, where I found myself constantly having conversations in my head about the election, saying, yes, what about this? And drawing historical analogies and so forth. And I thought, well, this kind of historical thinking might be helpful if I made this legible and visible to my students. The problem, as you all know, is that you can't propose a new class at Mason on a few months' notice. And so the opportunity to do that for 2016 passed us by, but then I proposed the class in 2019 for the following fall. So my vision for the class was that I would, as the instructor, anticipate the major issues that would animate the election of 2020. And I would, in my syllabus, set a schedule of traditional presentations to address the histories of those issues. And then those pre-prepared sessions would alternate with sessions that were more spontaneous class discussions to address new developments and the histories of whatever the new thing was in the 24-hour news cycle as they occurred, being mindful of the particular histories that those news stories would evoke. And so that was kind of the vision for the class. Putting that theory into practice was harder than I thought. So just in terms of the conceit and design of the course, I started to confront the depth and the breadth of what I didn't know. So it was a really humbling experience to, it's one thing to be listening to the radio while you're driving and playing what about with what you're hearing. And it's quite another to craft a quality lecture for undergraduates that addresses in a responsible, ethical, knowledgeable way the history of a complex issue. And so I realized that I'd committed myself to teaching many sessions that were way outside of my expertise. I did teach a lot of them, but my solution for that, as I'll talk about in a second, was to rely heavily on guest lectures. I also obviously didn't anticipate global pandemic and the sudden online shift to instruction. So that had happened the previous spring, but I, as of August, was still getting my feet under me in terms of online instruction. And I did teach the class online synchronous. And in that way, the pandemic created an opportunity that I wouldn't have had otherwise, which was to heavily involve guest lectures, because then it just involved people going to their desks and turning on Zoom rather than having to actually drive to the Fairfax campus on a non-teaching day. And so I ended up with more guest lectures than I ever would have been able to have if I had taught the class in person. And so my colleagues gave sessions that addressed the history of elections in the early republic, the history of global pandemics, the history of civil-military relations, and recent media history. And then I was able to leverage the expertise of outside experts to talk about the history of policing, contemporary Russia, and the history of the US Postal Service. And so that, I think, was a really wonderful space that got created where we could talk about a deeper history. But the unanticipated challenge was in clarifying constantly for myself, for my students, and especially for the guest lectures, what this class was and wasn't about, because I didn't want it to devolve into a history of the very recent past, and I didn't want it to devolve into an unproductive shit fight over contemporary political issues. And so, this really wasn't a history about 2020 or a class about 2020. It was a history about antecedents and broader contexts. I've always envisioned historians as the context people, people who help us to appreciate how we arrived at the present moment, and to offer antecedents that can be really useful for imagining how the world used to be. And I think in a different way that people with subject matter expertise on how all of the topics that I mentioned are addressed and operative in other countries would be similarly useful and enlightening by providing a comparative framework. So that was the design of the class. And in terms of the challenges that I confronted, obviously the online format, it was synchronous, and managing a discussion is challenging. So, we'll do our best here today. But also I think the challenge was in the class was less due to the volatility of the particular moment than it was to the demographics of the class itself. That by teaching one of the few online synchronous classes for history and art history, I had a large number of senior citizen retirees in my class. For the first time, they were a majority. And so, whereas we all know Mason to be a majority non-white, female university, suddenly my class is dominated by white men in their 60s and 70s. And so that was a really interesting challenge. And there were some very uncomfortable moments, no specific invocations of racism, but definitely a denial that racism in 2020 exists. And that was a challenging thing to manage. I don't claim to have done a good job with that. I did the best that I could to tend to my students of color and women students who found a great sense of erasure going on in the comments of other students. So I guess I'll say I was glad when it was over, is what I would say about that, although it was an enriching experience. The other thing I just want to touch on, and I'm happy to expand more in the Q&A, is about being an historian in a time of crisis and what historians can offer. And I think there's something instructive from military history, at least, or people who teach about war. You know, I'm looking back on my teaching career that began in 1998, and I started teaching the Vietnam War in about 2000. And of course, the world changed dramatically on September 11th, 2001. And my teaching has been informed by that. I don't think that I'm out on a limb in that I teach my Vietnam War class differently than other scholars do at other universities, but it is very much a class that is built around telling a cautionary tale. And it is very much informed by the experience of the ongoing global war on terror. And I think that's common in military history, is that there's a story of wars and of conflict is invoked as a kind of cautionary tale, a thing to be avoided, a monster that you don't want to tempt in the dark. But the problem with cautionary tales is that they are designed to scare the shit out of you. And what I confronted last March and April was when everyone was so scared, and when we were trying to figure out new patterns of living, new ways of working and learning, new ways of supporting our families, that the last thing that frightened people need is more fear. And so I found myself pivoting in my contact as an historian with public audiences, with my colleagues, and especially with my students, not towards cautionary tales, but towards tales of hope. And in a very different way, I found myself not trying to be the, well, what about person, not trying to offer the new, sharp, innovative interpretation, but rather to invoke very familiar narratives of people who confronted uncertainty and endured. And I brought a visual aid. I'm not the only person who found comfort in this. I don't know if you can read this. I actually flipped it so it'll be not backwards, but it's a meme that went viral, and maybe it's true and maybe it's not, but I have a number of friends online who are parents, and they found a lot of comfort in this. It purports to be a quotation from a person who survived the war in Bosnia, who said, your kids are going to be fine, right? And people took comfort from that. And I, found myself saying, well, of course, right? People have struggled and endured, and they have come out the other side, not unmarked, not necessarily whole, but as functional human beings. And so I think there's a lot that's instructive to take from conflict, not as the cautionary tale, though. I really don't think that's what we need right now. I think it is to take inspiration from people who have survived uncertainty and found ways through it. So I'll stop there, and thanks for the opportunity to share with you.
Thanks, Meredith. Tehama.
I just really enjoy listening to Meredith, so I look forward to more conversation with you. So I should identify myself very squarely as I am a political scientist. What am I doing here? I'm a political scientist who, in writing the book that was alluded to earlier, my co-author and I, who is also a political scientist, what we were trying to do is write a book that was going to kind of accompany us through political struggle, should we take up that struggle, to do what we can to advance anti-racism in the United States. And although when we were first approached to write the book, it was one about, can you explain the politics of Black Lives Matter? Yeah, we could try to do some of that. We've done some of that in other work. But what we felt like we needed, and primarily what we needed as educators, was to have some kind of something to hold on to in the class that was going to be speaking to context, that was going to tie, kind of outline the constellation of the way that Black life is made precarious in the United States, and to expand upon not just what many hear in the call of the streets, which is police reform, maybe abolition, and speaking immediately to the targeting and killing of unarmed Black people, but to also to broaden to really what many of the activists are thinking about themselves, which is, well, how also is this connected to health, and how also is this connected to education and wealth building and all the XYZs. What we're also trying to do is think about, well, one of the reasons why we're not maybe advancing as well as we could is that we're not taking enough time to say, well, what do you mean when you say such and such? And to talk about our lexicon around race and racism and anti-racism. And so we explore that, and it was necessary in that chapter, as in many other chapters, to go well outside of political science and to look to our colleagues in all their brilliance, and to look also to the Twitter sphere, quite frankly, as you referenced yourself, Meredith, is there's a popular wisdom that is growing, sometimes a popular other things, but popular wisdom is also out there. And to try to make sense of, like, how can we better communicate? Our third chapter, which was one that I took more stewardship over, was very much about history. And I was really cautious in thinking, I'm like, oh my God, like, I'm not a historian. I don't want to be like this historian dilettante where, people are going to come out of the woodwork and be like, and I thought, okay, what I have to draw on as many people as possible. Everything in our book is just trying to distill as much as possible, all these sources from other places, and tell some kind of story about the Reconstruction period, in order to impart, if there's a lesson here, that racial progress is neither linear nor inevitable. We have to struggle for it. And kind of also, how did we get here? And so I was very mindful in writing that, that of our humanities colleagues. The other chapters are about, ideological racial scripts that we carry around in our brains. We have a chapter on really trying to make federalism like something to hold on to and be excited about, because you can take control at the local level to usurp white supremacist practices, rather than what has been the case for so long of keeping white supremacist practices in place because of local politics, right? That egalitarians have their role there too. What we did in the process of writing the book is we wanted to hear well beyond political science. And so in addition to having the peer review, we assembled a group of scholars between in North Carolina. So people who came from Duke and UNC, NC State, Wake Forest, and we had people from English at the table. We had anthropologists, historians, and we want to say, how are we doing, right? And I think that there was so much to be gained in that conversation. And so kind of one of my roles, I guess, in being here today is to just affirm that, like, we need each other really badly. We need to be able to bounce off a lot of ideas, because it's not like, political science has a monopoly on the study of power. And you all know that very well. Sometimes political scientists need to be reminded of that. As far as, and so that's been kind of an experience of how, in what way am I relating to the humanities as a scholar, but also how is it relating to contemporary times of crisis? In the classroom, I'm also doing a lot of drawing on historians. So right now I'm teaching in the Honors College. I'm teaching a class called Whiteness in the United States. It's a course that I've taught previously at another institution, but a very different iteration of it. And a lot has happened, a lot has been published since I last taught it, probably 6 or 7 years ago now. And so Meredith, there's something that you said earlier about, kind of highlighting the antecedents and broader context, is to have a conversation and to have over the course of a semester about the meaning of whiteness. And then I also put in brackets whitenesses, just even opening up the possibility of thinking beyond a single, sense of racial identity. And in fact, right, that I also think about Blacknesses, and to make this more complicated, Latinidad, edness is, there's a lot of ways to explore that, but it's necessary for me to call especially upon historians in that work. I have another class right now at the graduate level in the Carter School. It's a new one for me, new prep, organizing for social justice. And so there's a lot of different types of writings that I'm bringing to the class, but one that I'm looking really forward to getting into is written by Adrienne Marie Brown. And her work draws heavily on Octavia Butler. So I'm really like, okay, where is that going to take us? And what does that mean for like our own political imaginations and agency? In other classes, Race and Conflict is another course that I teach. And there's admittedly a lot of social science and then also a lot of critical race theory. But what's able to happen in the classroom when I assign a short story by ZZ Packer is illuminating. It gets us into a different space. It helps connect dots. And so I'm just a big advocate for trying to weave together as much as we can the great wisdoms and knowledges and questions. And as I think about us all collectively going forward, especially at the university level, and we have this school of computing that is coming into being, I'm advocating that there be a very clear role for the teachings and the ponderings of ethics. So the role of philosopher, the role of the one who studies ethics is so necessary. I mean, even just thinking about the role of ethics in public policy should just really even be more amplified. It should be even more obvious that first of all, there's many ways to disseminate a vaccine, but what are the processes of thinking through that, and then how can we connect that person to maybe the brilliance of a political organizer who can see the world differently and say, listen, this is how you get things from point. This is the logistics of it all. If we can bridge these things, I think we could be better off. And so I'm just going to stop there and allow whoever is up is next. Thank you.
Thank you, Tehama. Next up is Jessica. I do think that we're going to want to sort of think about, and I know that some of the questions that we'll discuss are around sort of the pedagogical value of what we do in the humanities. So we'll revisit some of the stuff that both Meredith and Tehama brought up. But I'd like to turn the floor over now to Jessica.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for setting up this panel. And I can already tell it's going to be a really interesting discussion and conversation. So I'm going to give just a brief overview of the Pandemic Religion project that we're working on at the Center for History and New Media. This is a digital collecting project, and it seeks to collect and preserve different experiences of different religious communities in the US during the COVID pandemic. So this is what we would call a rapid response collecting project. It's happening in real time during the pandemic. It's ongoing. And it really aims to gather all sorts of digital content. So some examples would be images, videos, oral history recordings, different types of textual documents. We have a bunch of Zoom screenshots, as you can imagine, social media posts, and we're also collecting websites, archiving some website material. So we're collecting all this digital content to try to get at a couple of questions, help us answer a couple of questions. The first being, just very simply, how has COVID reshaped religious practices in different communities across different denominations in the US? And then how have different communities adapted during the pandemic and adapted their religious practices in particular? How are they now marking rituals like birth, marriage, particularly rituals around death and mourning during a time of such collective loss and grief? So anyone can upload materials to the collecting form on our website. And if you're interested in poking around and seeing what it looks like, we're at pandemicreligion.org. But we're also working with a number of partner organizations that submit materials from different communities across the country. And I can talk more about that, but as the project has grown and evolved, we've learned a lot about how important different partnerships are and how important it is to reach people in the communities where they're already engaged. So once we gather those materials, we at the center work on labeling and describing the materials. And very often those descriptions come from the creators themselves, and that's the ideal, but we also do some work with metadata to make sure that the materials are properly identified. And then perhaps most importantly, we display them publicly on our website, and you can browse through them there. We're using the digital exhibit software Omeka, which was of course also developed at CH&M and is widely used for these types of projects. So it's also kind of a digital exhibit that's constantly growing and evolving. And I think that public facing aspect is really important also to talk about. We've received some very interesting and moving material over the past year, and I encourage you to take a look. But everything from a video of a Zoom Seder to church choir songs recorded remotely, an outdoor Eid celebration at an Islamic community center. We have a lot of documents and emails around COVID policies at places, at schools, for example, or Jewish summer camps is another example. And a lot of materials about funerals and burial services that have been celebrated remotely or somehow differently. And of course, socially distanced outdoor activities, Bible study, and a myriad of other types of gatherings. Just this week, we received a video of the opening prayers in the US Senate chamber by Chaplain Barry Black, in which he speaks about the over 500,000 COVID-related deaths in the US. So those are just a few examples of the types of things that we're seeing, and it's been really amazing to see the different materials that have flowed in. A little background about the project. The project was founded by my colleagues Lincoln Mullen and John Turner in the history department last April in 2020, and they're both here, so hopefully they can join in on some of the discussion. But of course, April turned out to be just the beginning of the pandemic. And I think it's fair to say no one expected that this project would last this long. But it's been really interesting how the project has evolved over the past year. So in April, when I actually joined the center, we launched another digital collection called American Jewish Life in partnership with 6 Jewish organizations. And these are museums, libraries, universities, cultural organizations across the US. That collection has the same goal of collecting responses to the pandemic, but particularly focused on the experience of Jewish communities in the US. And then the last piece that we're working on now, and actually we're launching this site next week, is a new site called Collecting These Times, American Jewish Experiences of the Pandemic. And we're really excited about this. This is a project funded by a group of Jewish foundations, and it essentially will serve as a web portal for people to find a range of other collecting projects around American Judaism and COVID. We're by no means the only people or institution collecting on this topic, and that's actually, we see that as a really positive thing. As I said, it's really important to have this kind of network of myriad collections, different regions, different institutions, different types of communities. So we're still collecting materials, but we're also kind of moving our work to now serve as kind of a hub to connect other collecting materials and other collecting institutions across the country, and hopefully serve as an entry point for people to discover those materials. We're thinking a lot about access and discoverability. So again, just trying to leverage those networks and those partners to reach as many contributors and as many users as possible. Digital collecting, of course, has its own history, and that's a whole other conversation, but I think it's important to note CH&M was kind of a pioneer in this area when it created the September 11th Digital Archive all those years ago. And of course, the field has evolved quite a bit since then. There are many approaches to digital collecting, and there's a lot of ethical conversations that go into this as well. But I think one of the most important things to understand is that digital content won't necessarily be preserved unless we make efforts to collect and preserve it. So although we're all conscious of the fact that everything we do online leaves some kind of footprint, websites go down, links are broken, social media accounts close. So we can't assume that digital content, the digital content we're generating during this pandemic will be accessible in the future. So that's a big part of our aim as well, is sort of thinking about long-term preservation, thinking about access to these materials, certainly for researchers and students, but also just for members of these communities who are looking for ways to reflect and kind of process their experiences and find common ground with others. We're very attentive to ethical and privacy concerns, and that's something we could talk more about perhaps, but I think this is really important just to be sure that contributors are really actively agreeing to be part of this, and they're interested in being part of it. They're interested in their materials being public. We do keep some materials private if there are any concerns at all about, addresses, phone numbers, information that shouldn't be made public. So that's something we're always in conversation about. And I think it's just really important in the age we live in to think about those issues of what's public online. And I think it's important to just note that we're really interested in the participation of the creators of the materials as contributors. So we're not really going out and pulling material off websites. Of course, there's a ton of stuff out there about religion and COVID right now. But we're more interested in those relationships with those different institutions, those different communities, and really inviting people in as co-creators and collaborators. So in that sense, I think it really is a public history, public humanities project. And that's a part of it that I've really enjoyed. Finally, I'll just say we're really lucky to have some wonderful master's and PhD students working on the project, and some of them are here, which is great. So they've done a lot of work on the site itself, describing the materials, outreach to different communities, and also some interpretive work. And we're going to be turning more to interpretation, I think, this year. Students have already put some interpretive essays up on the site where they go through some of the materials and try to make meaning from them, find common threads, common questions, kind of weave a narrative out of those materials, and offer that also on the site. So I think in that sense, pandemic religion is also really a teaching endeavor. It's a teaching project. It's creating a space for Mason students to not only learn tools and methods of digital history and digital collecting, but also to reflect on and write about how COVID is reshaping people's lives and religious practices in this moment. And we hope that that extends beyond Mason as well. So we've worked on developing some teaching materials, teaching resources in the hopes that the collection itself and the collections that we now have can become inspirations for professors to develop assignments around them, ask students to write about these materials. This is really the kind of project that can help students think about the moment we're in, reflect on it, and process it. And I do think that's a place where the humanities has a lot to contribute to that kind of collective processing. So we've seen professors using the materials in history courses, religious studies courses, public history, digital history courses, and we're really hoping to continue to ramp that up. So I think I'll end there, and yeah, just to say that, I mean, my work on this project, in terms of thinking of it as a public humanities project, a lot of my work has been about sort of telling people what we're doing and why, and being able to explain that. And I think that that's a really important skill that that we all are, I think, working to develop in history and across the humanities and other fields as well, and perhaps has become even more urgent during this time as we're asked to kind of comment on things as they're unfolding and as we're living through them. So I'll leave it there for now, and really interested to discuss further.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I have a lot of questions, and I'm looking forward to asking you more specifically later on. But I do think it's really interesting to think about the way that the nature of religious rituals might be undergoing some sort of transformations that might have sort of long-term implications. And also sort of, I think, as you yourself pointed out, like, I think raising questions about the circulation of otherwise very private sacred rituals, right, in a larger context, which to me is incredibly interesting, and something that I would want to come back to later. But I want to respect the format, and I'd like to turn the floor over now to Andrew. Thanks a lot, Jessica.
I share your enthusiasm, Dr. Landsberg. Dr. Mack, let me applaud you for such a brilliant project, and Lincoln and Turner and the other students that are in the room right now. I'm eager to hear more and to peruse the website that you have put in the chat box. So thanks for doing that. So what I want to do today, just as everybody else has done, is kind of talk about how the humanities can contribute to the resolution of crisis, particularly public health crisis. But before I do that, I always find it's helpful when talking about the pandemic just to sort of take stock, to figure out where we are right now and reflect on where we've been. And that can kind of situate us, right? So Earlier this week, as Dr. Mack had referenced, America reached a really sad and grim milestone in the pandemic. Over 500,000 Americans have lost their lives to COVID-19. And if we crunch the numbers, that actually turns out to be an average, over a year, an average of roughly 1,369 deaths per day, or 57 deaths per hour, or roughly 1 American life every minute over the past year. And Americans have also experienced losses other than death, right? Those with long haul COVID are experiencing debilitating impairments, that they may have lifelong disabilities. Thousands of businesses are shuttered, millions have lost jobs, families have slipped into poverty. Our children have experienced learning losses, food insecurity and domestic violence has increased, as have mental health problems. Now, put this in perspective with where we were exactly a year ago, right? So at this time last year, we were all watching the televised in-person debates for the Democratic nominee for the President of the United States, right? In fact, last night this year, debate 10 happened, okay? The San Francisco 49ers and the Kansas City football team had just finished their showdown in the Super Bowl that was hosted in Miami Gardens, Florida. Over 62,000 sports fans attended that in person. Italy was just beginning to struggle with coronavirus cases, but that really seemed kind of a world away, right? And the CDC had only just started sort of sending out public alerts about the possibility of COVID-19 circulated within the community of the United States. In fact, stay-at-home orders had not yet been implemented in Virginia. Right? It was only until March 7th, 2020, when the first case was confirmed in Virginia, and that was a Marine that was stationed at Fort Belvoir. We were still teaching in the classroom. And on this day, exactly a year ago, as reported by the New York Times, former President Trump said, "I think it's going to work out fine," when he was asked about his worries regarding the novel coronavirus. How far we have come in just 1 year. Now, I don't want to drag everybody down into the sort of swamp of despair here. I know that this panel is supposed to be about hope and about how the humanities can contribute to solutions to this public health crisis and other crises that are afflicting the United States. But thinking back about the pandemic and how it's affected our nation over the past year, I think is helpful. And it also invokes kind of a sense of paralysis, right? The pandemic has impacted all of our lives in this virtual room. And I think that feeling of paralysis is especially acute among humanities scholars. So I imagine many of you, like me, you all felt an urgency to do something, to support the fight against COVID-19, right? But figuring out what to do in a public health crisis can be really tough. Most humanities scholars are not in the business of developing vaccines. Most humanities scholars are not also critical care physicians. Most humanities scholars are not on the front lines of our critical infrastructure. So it would seem that all of us in this room have to sit this one out, right? I think that's absolutely wrong. And in fact, I think humanities research is central and pivotal to the fight against COVID-19. And let me briefly explain why. So public health crises are never just about disease and treatment and counting the dead. They are also fundamentally political crises. They're crises that require nations and states and communities and individuals to make really, really difficult trade-offs. Trade-offs between individual freedoms of following individual freedoms or following simple public health measures like wearing a mask for the common good. Okay? Trade-offs between putting our kids back in school, but on the other hand, not wanting to expose them or our educators to risk of infection, trade-offs between the allocation of scarce vaccines among different priority groups or among different places throughout the nation that are afflicted more heavily by COVID-19, trade-offs between the allocation of scarce ventilators and ICU beds to individual patients as COVID-19 cases overrun the capacity of rural hospitals. Now, each of these trade-offs carries prospective benefits and risks. And it turns out that humanities scholars are actually experts at analyzing these benefits and risks and the background values that guide those trade-offs. So while most humanities scholars are not often gowning up in PPE to do rounds in the COVID ward, right, or venturing off to the NIH to develop mRNA vaccines, we are helping the cause by advocating for justice and for equity and the trade-offs that have absolutely framed America's response to this pandemic. Right? Medical science will surely bring an end to this pandemic, but it's our values that are going to get us through it. Right? And humanities scholars, in my view, have home field advantage in the study and analysis of these values. So with that in mind, let me just briefly use the rest of my time just to highlight a couple of pieces of work that I've done as a humanities scholar in response to this crisis. I'm briefly just sharing my screen right now. I have 3 slides to show you. So this is just a sampler of some of the work that I've done, both scholarly work and stuff that's been published in the media. And I want to highlight 3 of these projects. The first is this paper, this analysis paper was published in British Medical Journal. So early on in the pandemic, my colleagues and I, we analyzed a recommendation in extant triage protocols, which suggested that if ventilator scarcity became dire at hospitals, it is ethically permissible for physicians to forcibly withdraw ventilatory support from patients with poor prognoses for reallocation of that ventilator to patients with better prognoses. And after reading this recommendation in the triage protocols, you might imagine that my heart stopped. And our article here attempts to spell out how such a triage protocol might negatively impact people with disabilities. Now, following from this, my colleague in Mason's Department of Philosophy, Professor Wesley Buck-Walter, and I ran a nationwide survey of over 1,800 Americans asking what kinds of trade-offs they'd prefer in triage protocols in the COVID-19 pandemic. And among the various various experiments that we ran in this study, one of them was quite interesting. We found that most Americans favored equitable allocation of life-saving resources to Black Americans in particular, those communities who have suffered a disproportionate mortality burden from COVID-19, even if that meant that more people would not receive the same resources and perhaps that COVID-19 deaths might increase overall. I've also published some media pieces. This one came out most recently. And in this one, I reflect with my colleagues from the University of Pennsylvania on how Americans will mourn the pandemic. And I think that this is interesting in light of what Dr. Mack just reviewed. Watching President Biden and Vice President Harris at the reflecting pool on the eve of their inauguration, it did something to me. It made me feel something that I haven't felt in a long time. And my co-authors and I imagine that many Americans felt something similar. And so this essay was really trying to distill those feelings into writing. Now I should mention that this is just some of the work that I've done on the pandemic, and I'm happy to talk about it. And this research sort of sits on the background of the work that I do with the Greenwell Foundation. And this is an organization that's dedicated to advancing humanities and social science in medicine. And many of my colleagues in the Greenwell Foundation, the Greenwell faculty scholars, have done absolutely path-breaking work in the ethics and sort of humanistic dimensions of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of these recommendations and articles that they put out have absolutely shaped public policy with regard to how we're addressing the pandemic. And Encourage all of you to thumb through this. I'm putting in the chat right now a link to this page if you're interested in looking at the different information that's on this left-hand side and more. Now, one more thing before I yield the floor. Let me just say one thing just to spark conversation about the challenges of doing humanities research in a public health crisis or in a crisis in general. As many of you are well aware, humanities research is really, really slow. And the mechanisms for humanities scholarship are equally slow. Once you've written a paper, which takes you a long time to do, it often sits in a journal for up to a year before peer review is complete. And there's a virtue to this, right? There's a virtue to slow, careful, deliberate thinking. But that's, I've found, is absolutely incompatible with a crisis. Crises happen fast, right? The COVID-19 pandemic is not going to wait around for humanities scholars to get their act together and sort things out, right? We as humanities scholars have to keep up. So as our conversation unfolds today, I would be really eager to discuss not only the content of humanities scholarship in response to crisis, but also the process and the mechanisms of humanities scholarship in light of emergencies that need to be addressed here and now. So thanks very much, and I'm eager to start discussion.
Thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about here, and I actually want to pick up on some of what you just said, Andrew, as I move into the first question, and that has to do with what I think you're pointing to as a kind of distinction between long-term intellectual work, intellectual projects that sort of unfold over time, and sort of the more immediate sort of temporality of responding to a crisis. And so I wanted to ask the panelists more broadly, clearly we in the humanities are not producing vaccines. We're not at the front lines of criminal justice reform always, though obviously these are, crucially important projects to many of us. So what then is it that the humanities have to offer in times of chronic crisis, and in particular, the ones facing us in 2020? I mean, I think we've begun to get at some of this when thinking about our roles as educators. And so we can talk about that, but I'm also interested in hearing other thoughts that you all have about what it is that we in the humanities do have to offer. And again, like I see a kind of like practical dimension, and I see sort of the more sort of intellectual side of this project. And you can answer wherever you'd like to.
I'll just start by saying, because I ruminate about this a lot, that I think that one thing that we can do is help students or the publics with whom we engage to understand that the crisis is not singular, that it is part of a whole, right? So again, building out a context. And then also, especially given how atomized our existences have become, to offer reminders that the individual is a part of a community, that there is something greater than the self to be thinking about. And there can be something very empowering about being able to situate yourself and your own experience in the experiences of a broader community and in the experiences of a broader sweep of history.
I completely agree with what Meredith said. And I think, just thinking about this, our collection, but also other similar collections, I think that's kind of maybe one very practical way in which the humanities can offer some spaces and tools for people to share their stories, connect over their stories. So much connection is happening right now in virtual communities due to the nature of this crisis. And so I think holding space for that kind of human need to collectively process and reflect, and holding digital or virtual spaces for that is important. One of the challenges that I see for 2020 and continues into 2021 is just the problem of isolation and alienation, when especially at a time when people would like to come together and support each other and organize, the pandemic has made that more challenging in many ways. So I think, in a very practical sense, the humanities could provide some spaces for connection and reflection, digital spaces I'm thinking in particular, but anyone who is teaching right now in a virtual classroom has now developed some skills of sort of bringing people together in a virtual meeting, fostering discussion, which are really important tools and skills. It's not easy to do. So I think that providing those spaces beyond the classroom as well is a real contribution.
So
sorry,
go for it.
I actually have something to say too. I couldn't find my cursor to get myself off of unmute. So I've been thinking a lot about the title of this panel, right? So it's chronic crisis, right? I'm like, is a pandemic a chronic crisis? It feels more like an acute crisis, right? And it's become chronic in the sense that it's lasted over a year. But it is interesting in the sense that the pandemic, if we regard it as an acute crisis, has actually revealed chronic crises, right? The disproportionate effect of COVID-19 on BIPOC communities is revealing the chronic crisis of how social determinants of health have actually disproportionately affected certain individuals. There's another project that's ongoing right now that I have with the University of Pennsylvania folks, and we're looking at how the pandemic has affected people with dementia who are living in long-term care facilities, and and how it's affected caregiving. And oh my gosh, has the pandemic just revealed how complicated it is to be a caregiver, and the kind of crisis of caregiving that we have in the United States, because people were already hanging on by a thread, but the pandemic has just exacerbated those problems.
Yeah, I mean, you anticipated something that I want to ask about that I think is really interesting. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the political theorist Elizabeth Povinelli, who has argued that under late liberalism, there are certain kinds of chronic dispossessions, what she calls slow deaths, from poverty, from environmental racism, from systemic racial violence, that never rise to the level of event and therefore never really garner any kind of systematic response or redress. And it seems to me, and this is what you were alluding to, I think that the pandemic is an event in the sense that she describes, in that it has, sort of risen to the level of attention, has commanded a response. And I wonder if in so doing, as you've sort of begun to suggest, that it's rendered other chronic violences more visible and has lent, some of these chronic dispossessions, in Povinelli's words, a kind of eventfulness that might be productive. And I mean, and I'm thinking, obviously about the sort of awe-inspiring Black Lives Matter protest, for example, of the summer in the middle of the pandemic, right? There are, in every city around the world, people are standing up for this. So I'm wondering, if people want to sort of think about the way that this particular event raises other sort of chronic dispossessions into a kind of visibility.
I feel like I want to jump in, but I've been seeing Meredith with her hand up this whole time. Meredith, do you want to go?
I didn't see. Go ahead, Tehama, and then we'll go to Meredith.
I'm a rule follower, so I raise my hand and wait to be called on. But thank you, Tehama. So yeah, no, I feel like this I was responding to the juxtaposition of a chronic crisis versus an acute crisis, and yeah, I mean, my thoughts are running, but I think it speaks to a periodization, and that's something that historians contend with. And what we've come to, just broadly speaking, as scholars, is a recognition that nothing magical happens at the end of a year, nothing magical happens at the end of a century, right? That our understanding of how time moves and how processes change overrides these artificial understandings of time. And so, we're a long way out from being able to fully understand what this moment is. But my instincts tell me that it is something even bigger than the pandemic, that as we understand what's happening here, and how the world has changed. It is about some kind of social upheaval, and it is about just very basic things that informed the Enlightenment, right? Like, what is cause and effect? What is information? What is real and what is not real? So, you know, I encourage my students to think about being a historian as being a form of time travel, where we can project ourselves into the future and try to imagine how our present is going to be written and understood. And we certainly project ourselves into the past in the same way. And so, yeah, so I think I'm not convinced that this time is solely about the pandemic. We may in the very short term understand it in that way, but I'm not sure that we're experiencing an event that will end, that we are in perhaps in some kind of a forever something, or something that will be long and enduring, and we're not going to be able to make sense of it for a long time. Sorry to be a downer.
Tehama.
I think that's really insightful, actually. And I'll be thinking about that as I'm talking. I think what this just raises for me, your question, is how much we have normalized violence, how much we have normalized that certain lives over and over and over are valued, are seen as precious, are seen as being, you know, worth protecting, prolonging. It stuns me in that way. And so in all the talks that I've given over the past year, you know, people keep talking about, you know, the murder of George Floyd, and I think to myself, you know, like people make sense of the protest in relation to his death. And first, I think that there's something we have to broaden that, and we also have to ask ourselves, why didn't, you know, this particular outpouring of you know, happen earlier, because there was certainly plenty of evidence to that. And so what the role of the pandemic, and maybe shifting and in a really like way that hadn't happened before, reevaluations of life's worth and whose lives matter, perhaps was part of the impetus for what we saw over the summer. And yet I don't know if that fully explains that. I think social movement scholars of all types will be grappling over that. I think, like Meredith said, it's going to take a long time for us to understand that. But what I take away the most is how normalized these problems are part of who we are, at least in this country. And so what, you know, our agency here is, are we going to fight like hell for it to not be normal? Or are we going to adapt to the next way that life will be devalued along lines of identity in particular, and lines of access, you know, prior to, and then also because of the pandemic. We are all so tired right now. I mean, aren't you fatigued? Like right now in some way, like I'm energized by this, but I'm also just like, part of me is just dragging. And for us to summon enough oomph to be like, I'm going to keep pressing on, you know, on my elected officials. I'm going to keep demanding, you know, that something, you know, be changed. If it's in my school, if it's where, you know, at the hospitals, like whatever it is. Otherwise, I'm afraid we will be lulled into the next normalization of incredible violence, and also in the same way that, like, the way we're treating our planet, and then what that makes for our own home, you know, in the long term. So I'll rest there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're pointing to is so important. And there's and I guess one of the things I'm trying to ask in this question is the way that the pandemic has denaturalized everyday life so dramatically that we're able to see other things anew, right? And so and I think the question that you're raising, Tehama, is how can we continue to keep that in view, right? I mean, because it's very, you know, the way that it's always been the case that, you know, it's too hard, you know, we're too lazy to sort of continue to fight these fights that we need to be fighting, right? And so the sort of violence gets naturalized and normalized. But I think, like, one of the things I'm asking about, I mean, the pandemic has provided an opening here, right? It's given us a critical vantage point on, and not just us. I mean, we a lot of us have that critical vantage point, but it's like given, you know, people, you know, in the United States and elsewhere, critical vantage point on these chronic dispossessions, on this sort of systemic violence, and the sort of the way that, as you said beautifully, that certain lives are valued in a way that other lives aren't valued. And so, you know, this is an instance of, like, we have this insight, you know, that sort of, like, I think an insight that our sort of humanities, sort of critical thinking enables us to have. The question then is, like, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we, as humanities scholars, continue to sort of make this visible? I mean, it's been made visible for us right now. How do we sort of, you know, keep it visible and not let it get certain, and not let this sort of violence, systemic violence, get naturalized? There's some hands up. I'm going to take some hands from the audience, but the panelists are welcome to join in as well. Christy.
Hi, everyone. Oh, hold on. I'm logged in twice right now. So as not to drop this important conversation. Let me put my hand back down. I'm also a rules follower, Meredith. Listen, this is so important, and, you know, something that Tehama was getting at, and that you're sort of pushing forward with, Allison, about what we can do. You know, as there are things we can do as humanists, certainly, but there are things that we should do as human beings who occupy certain positionalities, right? I think something that's so sort of chronically dangerous about the academy is that, you know, we hold ourselves up, even in collaborative work, you know, in front of our computers, and we think, and we put things out, and we put them in public venues, or we put them in scholarly venues, and we talk to each other in conversations like this. But we, you know, we become disembodied in so many ways, and we can click forward, you know, turn off our screens and go have a cup of coffee and kiss our children, and everything's okay. But, you know, our own positionalities, because so many people in the academy do not experience these violences, right? You know, it's easy to sort of turn it off and to make it a heady exercise and something that works us and that we feel truly, you know. And I really appreciated, Andrew, your sort of, you know, opening up to that emotional moment of sort of, you know, looking at the president and vice president and their spouses and feeling, you know, that response in yourself and saying, okay, I need to do more now. You know, we have power in our spheres, right? The university, as Tehama was mentioning, is one of the prime places of violence, right? Of literal violence against Black people on campus. This thing about police commissions and councils on campus is real. We have students who have experienced police brutality on our campus. We have faculty who experience police brutality in our campus, and staff. So, you know, I think that, you know, none of us necessarily got into the humanities because we wanted to be administrators. I think we got in because we like thinking about these issues. We like thinking. We like trying to make the world a better place. But I think a really important place to start is looking at yourself and looking in your department. And looking in our college and getting engaged, because they're trying to make changes right now. This Anti-Racism and Inclusive Excellence Task Force is trying to make changes, trying to sort of pinpoint and undo some of the violence that is, whether sublimated or not, it's all normalized. And it's violence that not everyone experiences the same. And I think that's the greatest challenge. But there's something at our fingertips that we can actually do. And, you know, there's this quote that I've been thinking of a lot. I think it's an Alice Walker quote, you know, that the way that most people give up their power is by not knowing they have it. Is it Alice Walker or Maya Angelou? I'll look it up. But that's the issue. We actually do have it. We have lots of power, and we see it in our public facing work, but also in the things we can do at the university. We can help people that are right in front of us, and we can help ourselves. I hope not to be a victim of police brutality on campus at night, walking to my car.
Thank you. Thank you for those really important thoughts, Christy. I mean, and the other way I think that we can do this work at the university is through our teaching, right? By how, and we'll sort of return to this topic of teaching, I think, shortly. But clearly that's a place where we have the capacity to really make an impact as well. I see that Ashley has her hand up, so I want to take Ashley's question or comment.
Hello, everyone. Christy, I mean, you almost took the words right out of my mouth. I do have a question, but that was so great. I mean, as a Black person, even in this space right now, I'm like, y'all talking about me, but I don't really see a whole lot of me. And so I think so. It's all of that. I'm everywhere, but I think that. My question, it's a question. I had a question. So my dissertation currently is looking at the intersections of how COVID-19, Black Lives Matter movement post George Floyd, and the Trump administration all have impacted Black women's reproduction, or may have some impact on Black women's reproduction. And I am looking and talking to Black women about ways in which they persist through all of that. As a form of, you know, resistance, liberation, etc. So my question to the panelists, right, understanding that all of these things may be intertwined, you have your focus in your own areas, but maybe talk to how the aspects of someone else's area as your co-panelists serve and how you look at your area, understanding that they all may intertwine, especially, I mean, in the year of 2020 alone, they all intersected in a way. So I'm really curious as to how you all look at the intersections of these other crises when looking at your area. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley.
I've spoke a little bit about that in some way pre-pandemic, trying to look at various crises in writing. Right now, the most active thing, which I have to admit, like I'm not getting much writing done. Like I have a full manuscript that is waiting to be edited, and to get myself to it right now was just like, it's not happening. And but what I can do, which I'm learning how to do, the, you know, work smarter, not harder or more, is to build elements of, like, you know, research more into my teaching, and projects and practice into my teaching. And so I've started, which is really going to be a bit of an oral history project, but also a speaker series called Beyond the Spectacle. And I've embedded that into my organizing for social justice class. And so the idea, and this has been in the works for over a year, so pre-pandemic, and now it's, you know, there's this changing, always this adapting, was just thinking about how do organizers do their work, and not just like the logistics of how they do the work, but like the, you know, the matter of self-care has come up so much, particularly in this pandemic. How are people taking care of themselves and others, and how have they been doing that over time? You know, how do you work in imperfect conditions? Where are unexpected alliances? These types of storytelling that will hopefully privilege more interdependence rather than figurehead, you know, posturing. And so we've had our first speaker, a formerly incarcerated woman who is organizing currently and formerly incarcerated women and girls in the state of Tennessee. And in these conversations, we only had one so far, but we're planning the next, is that what's coming out is just it's really impressing upon me how important it is not only to get out of my own disciplinary shell, but to, I'm inviting the bridging of this academic space as a holder with my fellow citizen and resident in the United States, and learning and understanding, or trying to understand their own expertise and own wisdom that they're holding class for us. And I'm really, it's something that is giving me energy and otherwise a time where I'm draining. So that's one way that I'm trying to look around right now. There's other things I could talk about. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. I see John Turner has his hand up. Meredith, were you going to answer the question that Ashley posed?
I was, yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, yeah. So Ashley, thank you so much for that question. And I don't know that I necessarily have an answer for it, but I do want to normalize the struggle that I'm hearing, which, I mean, you talked about some very big areas that are intersecting in your work on Black women's reproduction. And I think that your question, if I'm understanding it correctly, or maybe it's just how it resonated with me, exposes a structural problem with how the academy is organized, that basically we as scholars are not encouraged to consider intersections, but are rather encouraged to focus on what is particular and specific, and we are discouraged from making generalizations. And I can certainly up and down defend that as someone who has advised many, many graduate students that it is important to have deep and particular knowledge in a given subject area. And we don't want to be producing doctorates that are, a function of dilettantism. But on the other hand, I think there is a worship in the academy for what is novel and so-called innovative and original. And there's a lack of appreciation for synthesis. And I think in some ways, the current crisis, or chronic crisis, however you want to think about it, is exposing some of that, because we are all just awash in emotions and fatigue and also ideas, and seeing the world in new ways. And yet the strictures of how we're supposed to publish, how an article is supposed to count towards this or that requirement with your job is not really encouraging of that kind of exploration. So if you're feeling unsettled by that problem, I just want to say that I'm sitting with you, and I feel it too, that I feel overwhelmed by the thoughts and the ideas, but the structure of a dissertation, the structure of how we're supposed to push knowledge out into the world is in opposition to that kind of exploration.
Right. And I mean, I'm sort of hopeful that the Center for Humanities Research, in its attempt to sort of like bring together people from really different disciplinary backgrounds to confront issues, to discuss issues together, might be a sort of baby step towards that kind of, the kind of, and I think you've seen this at work, Ashley, in the fellows meetings. But I think that this is, part of the hard work of being, of doing the kind of work that we want to do, but sort of speaking across these disciplinary boundaries to recognize the interconnectedness of these kinds of problems is really crucially important. So I thank you for that also, Ashley. John.
Thanks. I've been so fortunate to work with Jessica and Lincoln and several other folks who are on the session as well. And it's so inspiring to hear what Tehama, Andrew, and Meredith have been doing. One of the things that Christy's very wise comment made me think about is that, again, in terms of positionality, superficially, I've had a pretty good pandemic. I can collaborate with these wizards at the Rosenzweig Center online. They can build websites, without getting together in person. It's amazing. We can form new partnerships, teach online, have great sessions like this. And this sort of thing is only possible if universities and people who work at them really advocate and invest in the humanities. In terms of positionality, we have a generation of PhDs PhD students wondering if they're going to have opportunities like this in the future. Many humanities departments at George Mason, but and especially elsewhere, are wondering about the attenuation of tenured lines, which really provide for this sort of space. I think it's just so critical that our institutions, which do have tremendous financial resources, advocate for and invest in the humanities. And I think we can't make that case often enough.
Thank you, John. I see, Andrew, that you responded to Ashley. Did you want to say something publicly?
No, I don't want to take up more time, but I thought that the paper was apropos, the comment that Ashley had made. So I hope that that's helpful.
Excellent, thank you. So I did want to turn our discussion to teaching, right, to the pedagogical value or potential value, right? Because I think that it's, that the points that Christy raises are, absolutely, are absolutely right. And obviously sort of institutionally, like there are fundamental problems, challenges that we have to work actively to undo. The other thing, as I said, that I do see us, sort of able to do is to teach this to our students, right? To teach white supremacy to our students. And I think, I know that many of us do this in a range of different ways in our classes, but I wanted to sort of, to sort of turn our discussion for a moment to the, to what we are able to do in our teaching, what we aren't yet able to do, but want to do, how have we approached teaching these crises in our classes? I think I'm curious to know in what ways this past year, not just the pandemic, but obviously the sort of racial reckoning that's happening, how has this influenced the way that you teach, what you would like to teach? And this is, I think this raises a larger question that Christy was raising that I'm also interested in, which is about how we understand the relationship between theory and sort of knowledge production that we do and praxis in our own lives.
I'll just jump on. So because I'm teaching whiteness in the United States, this is immediately happening right now in my class. And there's different ways to approach this. You can do this chronologically this way, that way, you can mix it up. And I thought to myself, my student, we need to talk about, and I need to introduce the idea of normativity. What does it mean for something to be normative? I need to demonstrate to them the myriad ways that white people are racially advantaged, and yet that there's such an array of also privilege amongst white people, that it's not straightforward. There are paradoxes to privilege, as Alan Johnson would say. And then we're going back in time. And so here's where we are. How do we get here? And, we're starting with the colonial time period here. And right now we've moved up, we're in the eugenics. They're about to have their minds blown because none of them have heard of the eugenics movement. So it's like, pause there, right, for a moment. And what's the role of Virginia? There's a whole day just dedicated to that. And in the assignments that I'm giving, I'm asking them, at least to begin with, like first we actually had them read the entire Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and Amendments 11 through 27, and to look for racial meaning making out of that. And that was, for some, really the first time they'd done it. The other thing I'm asking them to do is to write about, to do a photo essay about a topic related to whiteness, somewhat autobiographical. And the thing that I'm finding that they're struggling at the moment is to be able to talk about whiteness and not talk about just comparing for the sake of comparing groups or places, but what does the comparison in those places or people mean for whiteness? And it's so hard for them. And yet, to talk about white supremacy, people are latching onto that as a catchphrase, but they're not talking about whiteness. They're not even defining, or it's hard for them to define at times what white supremacy is, but they'll drop it in a conversation. They'll say, check your privilege, but not tell you what does that mean. They'll call out, but don't know how to call in. And so there's a whole universe of things to think about when we're talking about normativity, normalization of violence. And I'm just trying to take these little chunks of like, how can we do this together? And also for there to be a place to grow without being condemned for your ignorance, right? Or it's hard. It's very challenging, and I'm doing my utmost right now, but it's one of the most necessary things that I think I do at the university, period.
Deepthi.
My hand was up right after John, so but this is a much more interesting conversation. But just putting this out there because we're talking about positionality, as John mentioned it. There's a new book by Leonard Cassuto and Robert Weisberg called The New PhD, and it's about reforming the graduate education in the United States. And the one statistics, I mean, they give a really great overview of how we got here in the university, especially regarding sort of graduate education in the arts and sciences program. The one statistic that really stood out for me is in a study that they did for PhDs who graduated from 2005 to 2015, I believe. Of those PhDs, only 12% are employed in a tenure track job. 12%. Someone else told me that you have a better chance of, being selected to play in the pro ball games. And so while we are having all these great discussions here, I'm concerned that we are also sort of letting the reality of having these conversations and the privilege of having these conversations being sort of constricted to that 12%. And probably that number is going to go down. So just putting that out there. Sorry, Christy.
Did any of the panelists want to respond?
I would just say I completely agree with Deepthi, and I think it's a huge concern. And I think just kind of connecting also back to the teaching question. I mean, one of the things I've learned about teaching this year, when the COVID pandemic started, I was teaching at Rutgers University last spring, and from that experience of sort of everything moving online, just really thinking more about treating students as whole people and humans, and very much to everything that Christy raised, which I really appreciate your comments on that, because I think it's a really important lesson that we shouldn't when everything went online, which was this idea from some people that sort of, well, we have to be performing at a top level no matter what, and this idea that there are no excuses, et cetera, which I think just really like deepens and reinforces inequalities that already exist. And so just, I'm trying to kind of bring that perspective to teaching, but to also any gathering like this, to just acknowledge we don't know what people are facing, and people are facing a myriad challenges, the pandemic just one of them, right? But of course, chronic violence and the threat of violence against many communities. So I think, and I'm hoping that's something that we can bring forward, into the post-pandemic as well. And with sort of like making these issues visible, but also keeping them in mind and not going back to sort of a normalization practice, but really thinking about sort of the whole human being and how do you bring that to your teaching? How do you bring that to working with graduate students who are facing a lot of challenges, as Deepthi pointed out, on the job market? And really, how do you bring that to any interaction with a group of people in a professional or personal setting? I'm hoping that's something that we can hang on to.
There actually is I think, a pretty significant ethical dimension to a lot of these issues right now that we're discussing. And I'm wondering, Andrew, if as our resident ethicist, if you have thoughts about any of these sort of various ethical questions that have come up in the last, bit of discussion.
I'm afraid I don't really have much, anything really smart to say with regard to this. And I think that I'd have to process it for a bit more. Yeah, so I'd be very open to sort of hear other people's thoughts.
Christy?
Thanks. I don't know if you have this in your disciplines. It's very alive in French history and French studies, is the sense that one thing is true science, true academic inquiry, and another thing is political engagement. That these things are totally decompartmentalized. So it's sort of, or compartmentalized. So on one side, we are somehow neutral, and must come from that standpoint, which in itself is a complete fallacy, right? Like what we teach, it always has an ethical dimension. It is by nature political, and what we put on our syllabi, what we don't put, by nature has an ethics. And so, what I'm thinking right now, what I think is happening is that it seems to me there's more willingness, there's an understanding more than ever before, at least in my time in the academy, that all people are aware of their positionality more than in the past. And people are wanting to do the things differently, but they don't feel qualified and they don't really know how. And they're afraid that by putting some things on the table that, somebody might come at them and say, well, like, who are you to talk about this? And, you're this, white man who's had it easy your whole life, which you haven't, because that's not how life is. Not only the scale of privilege and of possibilities, but life is just hard, that's a human thing. Nobody is, sort of absolved of that. So, I think something really helpful is to create spaces in which people who want to learn, like you were saying, Tehama, don't have to be ashamed, to say, like, there's no question here of anybody being smart or having goodwill. Now we just need some practical techniques for how to do something different in my syllabus, and to hear stories of people making mistakes. I've made really shitty mistakes in my time at Mason, as I've tried to be culturally open and done so in clumsy ways. And I've lost students. And so it's not because I am a Black woman that I don't make mistakes, and so I think we have to, be open to these discussions. I think the Humanities Center is a really special place for that to happen. And I'm really glad that you asked the question about teaching, because it's, another thing that we don't always talk about enough, and that's not valued by the university as much. So I'm really glad to have those discussions. And I just published an article. It's about the 18th century, but about critical race theory and thinking about the Enlightenment from a multicultural perspective. And it gives some examples of how we can engage critical race theory in very sort of, in small steps, and there are great books. You could just use it. You don't have to reinvent the wheel to move into that territory and experiment with it, and be willing to make a mistake. And we can all go have a drink at the Humanities Center next year and talk about it and get over it.
Thank you so much for that. Well, we have come to the end of our time here, and I want to thank everybody so much for your participation. I think that, clearly the work lies before us. So let's take that charge and go forward and continue this important work that we have to do both within the university and outside of the university as humanists and as human beings. So thank you all very much. Let's thank our panelists for their participation. Goodbye, everyone.